Okay, we're about at time here, so let's get started. So hey everyone, thanks so much for coming out today. We really appreciate it. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Cassandra Barras, and I'm the director of the mentorship program at Strive. I'd like to start off talking a little bit about what opportunities we offer in the mentorship program. And if you have any questions about them afterwards, you can come find me or email at mentoring@striveclubs.org. So the broad goal of the mentorship program is just that we want to connect students and professionals a little bit better in this movement, and just have mentors for the students, and just have everyone being used as a resource and fostering those connections. So there are a couple different ways we do that. One is that we have monthly webinars with professionals across a wide variety of fields, but all who have a background in objectivism and try to use it as a moral framework. And we just have students and whoever wants to attend really come on and ask their questions about the field or about the applications of objectivism in the field. And it's just a nice opportunity for students to get that advice. We also have the opportunity to pair students individually with a mentor. And again, wide variety of fields. Students will be able to connect short or long term with someone in their field, and again, with a common framework of objectivism. So if you're at all interested in being a student in this program, or possibly being a mentor, or just want to show your support, again, come find me or email at mentoring@striveclubs.org. With all of that being said, I'd like to introduce Alex Epstein, founder and president of the Center for Industrial Progress and the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. Today, in his talk, Alex will be discussing intellectual persuasion. He will share with us the biggest lesson he has learned about how to persuade people of controversial but true ideas. Now, with that being said, let's all welcome Alex Epstein.
On a scale of -5 to 5, how good are you at persuading others of true ideas that they honestly do not agree with? On a scale of -5 to 5, how good are you at persuading others of true ideas that they honestly do not agree with? So first of all, why am I asking you on a scale of -5 to 5? Anyone want to take a guess? Thomas Iden?
Because in your attempts to persuade someone, you can actually push them further away from what you want to convince them of.
That's absolutely right. In any form of communication, including relationship communication, sometimes when we open our mouths, we make things worse. And I discovered this early on when and I'm not talking about relationships. There are examples of that, but that's a different talk that I'm not qualified to give any solutions on. So I read Atlas Shrugged when I was 18 years old, and was completely enthralled with it, and had a very deep conviction that this way of thinking was unique and important, and that everybody I knew needed it. But I was not very good at persuading them of that, and I think often I would alienate people, as enthusiastic as I was. Can anyone relate to this in your own experiences with Atlas Shrugged or other things from Ayn Rand? And this is very, very frustrating. And I have a couple of examples from college where I was in class with someone, and they would come back later, many years later, and say, hey, you know what? You were an asshole back then, and I didn't agree with anything. But it turns out you were right because I read Ayn Rand. Right? But that's not where I wanted to be. So the good news was that it really bothered me to be unpersuasive. I never particularly found the uniqueness or the outsiderness, if that's a word, of objectivism appealing. I didn't like that people disagreed with it. I found this deeply disturbing, and I thought that there must be a way of getting others to agree with it. And thus, since I was 18 years old, I've had this, I think, incentive set where I was interested in this very controversial but true set of ideas, and I was really interested in persuading others. And I think a lot of people legitimately just use the ideas and benefit from them themselves and apply them to their fields, but they're not obsessed with persuasion. And that's often very rational, but I am obsessed with persuasion. And today, even if you're not obsessed with persuasion, I will give you something that will make you much better at it. And I think I know that can benefit you in any area of life. So again, from -5 to 5, how good are you at persuading others of true ideas that they honestly do not agree with? So I'm going to count down from 5 all the way to -5, and we'll see if anyone's bold enough to say 5. And just raise your hand, or if you're welcome to abstain, no pressure. All right, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. So this is by far the highest self-rankings I've ever gotten, but I usually ask this question to fossil fuel companies about how good they are at persuasion. Okay, -1, -2, -3, -4, -5. All right, so the main thing is there's a ton of value in getting better at this, and it's difficult. So I imagine most of you are here because you have some familiarity with my work that applies philosophy to energy and environmental issues. But I think the most relevant part of it for today is that work is, I would say, unusually persuasive in terms of being being a very controversial set of ideas, and certainly also being a set of ideas that's explicitly derived from objectivist philosophy. So it's not very common to have a set of ideas derived from objectivist philosophy that have a popular following, that are like a legitimately that lead to like a legitimately best-selling book, well over 50,000 copies in circulation, that lead to things like being paid $20,000 to go speak to people for speaking engagements. All of these are just measurements for me of people are actually finding this interesting. And I have the baseline because when I first started coming up with the ideas about energy, nobody was interested. Now, I didn't understand them as well, but the main thing is I learned how to persuade people better. So over the years, again, I've been working on this since I was 18. I'm 36 now. And I think that in the last few years, particularly writing the moral case for fossil fuels, and then being hired by companies to teach others how to be persuasive, I've really broken down persuasion in a way that I haven't heard anyone else do, and that certainly has helped me. So you have a handout, and if you have a pen, I'm encouraging by these blanks to fill things in. But also, if you just email me, which is at the end of that email instructions, I will give you the fully filled in handout, because as you'll see, I have a couple of very concrete exercises that I recommend doing, and I'll say them out loud, but you won't have to write them down if you get the actual worksheet. All right, ready to go? So, there are two concepts I want to talk about today, and the second is an application of the first, but I think the most important application of the first. So, concept number 1 is context bridging, and concept number 2 is reframing, which is a form of context bridging. So we have context bridging and reframing. So why context bridging? Well, remember my initial question, which was, how good are you at taking somebody who, convincing someone of the truth who honestly does not agree with you? And that can mean that they honestly disagree or they're just ignorant on the issue. So I think a really helpful way to think of that epistemologically is just that there are two contexts involved. So there's their context, which you can think of as point A, so which is the sum of their relevant knowledge on the topic. And then there's your context, which is point B. And all you're doing in persuasion is you're trying to add to their context to bridge it toward yours. So you're trying to make some progress, and how much progress depends on the medium. Like a book can make more than a tweet, right? A lecture series can make more than one lecture. But the idea is they have a context, you have a context, and you're bridging between them. And I think if you think of it in that way, it yields, it's just very, very helpful. So that's the key idea I want to start with. And so there are 3 steps to context bridging. And then I'm going to give you details on exactly how I think about and implement each one of these. All right, so the first step is you have to very clearly understand your context. So very clearly understand your context. And this is easy to overlook, particularly if we're dealing with ideas that we did not originate, which in terms of objectivist ideas is true of all of us. None of us originated them. Right, so if you have ideas that you did not originate and you're trying to persuade others of them, you have to be really, really, really clear on all the relevant pieces of knowledge that actually make those ideas true. So here are some, I'm going to give you some questions that I ask for, some tools that I use, and I'm going to apply it to my case, which is not objectivism as such, but is this idea of a moral case for fossil fuels. The idea that humanity has a moral obligation to use more fossil fuels, not less. All right, so here are a few, and I'm going to go through these semi-quickly. If you're a fast writer, you might get them down, but I want you to sort of take in the idea, and again, I'll send out the handout with all of these. All right, so one question is, what is the essential position I want to communicate? What is the essential position I want to communicate? So I just said that with moral case for fossil fuels. What are the fundamental logical steps that lead to that position? So for any given position, there's some set of premises that are key to proving it true. You have to be very clear on what those are. Here's one I find really helpful. What are one-sentence condensations of each of these steps? So let's say you identify the steps, but you identify each one in a paragraph. Being able to condense it into an essential is extremely valuable. Another one. What are 3 concrete examples of each of these steps? So let's take, some of you are familiar with moral case for fossil fuels. So what would, let's see how well I did in the book, what do you think is one crucial step to making a moral case for fossil fuels?
Set the standard of value.
Okay, and we're going to talk about that more under reframing, but set the standard of value or standard of evaluation. Identify what you mean by moral, because if you don't know what you mean by moral, you can't argue that something is moral. Another one, how about a more concrete point? Yes?
What are fossil fuels?
What's that?
What are fossil fuels?
Okay, what are fossil fuels? So that, I mean, depending on how much knowledge you're assuming, we'll talk about that in a minute. Yes, so you do have to establish that. I wouldn't say it's one of the fundamentals and that it's somewhat of a given. Anyone else want to try? Yes?
Establishing why it's a moral issue.
Establishing why it's a moral issue. I mean, that's sort of done by the standard of value, and there's motivation. Abden?
What is energy? Why is it important?
Yeah, so let's just take energy as a fundamental of human flourishing. Like, to get the moral case for fossil fuels, to get that we're morally obligated to do this, we have to get that energy is a fundamental of human flourishing. And then this sort of leads to the next thing. Well, does that mean fossil fuels are fundamental of human flourishing? No. So then you have to have another premise, which is that fossil fuels are a uniquely scalable form of energy for billions of people. And then what else do you have? Well, you have concerns about fossil fuels, so and understandable concerns. So you have to deal with concerns about resource depletion. So there's a premise about that. You have to deal with concerns about pollution. So there's a premise about that. You obviously have to deal with things related to the climate issue, CO2. So there's a premise about that. And if you look at the structure of the book, it's very non-accidental. Chapter 2 is the value of energy. Chapter 3 is the uniqueness of fossil fuels. Chapter 4 is half the climate issue. Chapter 5 is half the climate issue. Chapter 6 is half the pollution issue. Chapter 7 is half the pollution issue. Chapter 8 is the resource issue. So to write that book and to be convincing, I had to have a very clear step-by-step idea. So in order for you to prove a point, you have to be clear on the key steps. And this, by the way, is not primarily about convincing others yet. It's about convincing yourself. It's about identifying these are the key things that are necessary for me to establish in my own mind to make this true. So once you do that, then you can come up with concrete examples of each. You can come up with the condensations. And then here's a last one that I find absolutely essential, which is what are the best arguments you can make against your position? And why are they wrong? Or are they wrong? But what are the best arguments you can make against your position? So, for me, it might be, well, prestigious scientific organizations claim that climate models prove an imminent climate catastrophe due to man-made CO2 emissions. Or it might be energy has evolved to a state where solar and wind are more affordable and certainly cleaner way of powering civilization. So these are all things that have to be examined. So if you're this clear on your context, it's just such a powerful, powerful thing. So that's step one. But it's not enough. So step two is, well, can anyone guess what step two is? If step one is being really clear on your context? There's one other participant in this, this dance.
Your opponent's context.
Well, interesting. So opponent is not quite the way I would put it.
Okay.
Right? Because particularly, this is important because the premise of this is we're talking about intellectual persuasion of people who honestly don't agree. So it's a really important principle that when we're in conversation, it's on the premise that they're honest, and if we're not, we're not on that premise, we have to leave. You can't be there halfway. And just an example of this with a friend of mine who shall not be named. We were walking around Irvine, California once, and there were these two girls from Greenpeace. And I am, you might know, prone to liking to get a camera and tape myself talking to these people. But primarily to convince or persuade just members of the general public, because I find people who are Greenpeace advocates to be very, very difficult to persuade and almost always dishonest in one way or another. So I was not interested in just persuading them, but my friend thought that one of them was cute. And I said, like, there's no physical appearance in the world that could make this worthwhile. Like, it's not going to go well. And I said, if you want to make yourself a valuable citizen, get out your iPhone and tape me talking to one of these people, because you're going to waste your time. And he did not listen to me. And so I ended up talking to the other one. And I'll tell you how non-open to reason this young lady was. We had a discussion about the state of solar and wind and Germany. And I said, well, Germany is not powered by solar and wind. Those are enormous costs to their electricity system, but they're overwhelmingly powered by coal. Particularly now, because they shut down a bunch of nuclear plants, they're building a dozen new coal plants. And she said, oh, that's not true. I read it, it's not true. And I said, okay, well, do me a favor. When you go home, will you look it up on Google, and then will you email? And then I said, wait a second, what decade are we in? I'll look it up right now. So I look it up on my iPhone. First thing that comes up is Germany's building 12 new coal plants. And I show this to her and say, so what do you think? She said, I don't know, I'll think about it. Like, it was that difficult, right? So that I would not have gotten in that conversation except for sheer boredom, because my friend was hijacking this. Imagine, so you could have seen this on tape if not for the friend who shall not be named. But when I do get into a conversation, I treat the person as honest. And even with this person, I treated her as honest because I was in the conversation. So I think that's an important idea. So once we are on this premise that the person is honest, or at least potentially honest, yes, it's all about their context. And this is a slight exaggeration, but not one that's, it doesn't matter how much of an exaggeration it is, because you can't do it enough. You basically can't understand your audience's context well enough, particularly on issues that you're passionate about. So you basically can't do it. I mean, I've never met anyone, let's put it this way, I've never met a professional intellectual who I thought had spent too much time understanding the nuances of their audience. Because it's just, you think about how well a salesman understands the nuances of his audiences, right? Great salesmen have incredible knowledge of their audiences. Great marketers have incredible knowledge of their audiences. There's no difference with intellectual persuasion. So here are some questions that I think are helpful to ask about your audience. What arguments have they been exposed to? What do they know that I can count on? What don't they know that I need to explain? What do they think they know that's wrong? What are their strongest values? What are values they have that I can appeal to? So what this line of questioning is getting at is just getting a very clear mental map of how your audience's mind works, how the other person's context really lives. So I'll take it with moral case for fossil fuels. So let's just take, what arguments have people been exposed to about that issue that are contrary to mine? Anyone think of any?
We're going to run out of fuel.
Okay, we're going to run out of fuel. What else?
Killing the planet.
Okay, broadly killing the planet. Come on, more. You guys live in civilization.
We're going to flood Florida.
Yes.
Pollution.
Pollution. Yes.
Catastrophic climate change.
Okay, catastrophic climate change. What about more concrete things? Yes.
Ice caps are gonna melt and flood Florida, etc.
Okay, good. More.
There's a lot of opportunity in green technology.
Okay, good. Opportunity in alternatives. Yes.
New York will be underwater by 2050.
Right, so New York will be underwater. Yes.
Context of the Dakota access pipelines poisoning the water supply.
Okay, so particular fossil fuel projects are compounding the global poisoning with local poisoning. Yes.
Green energy creates more jobs.
Green energy creates more jobs. Yes.
We hurt poor people in other parts of the world.
Yeah, climate justice. Yes.
The putative need for energy independence.
Okay, yeah, need for energy independence. Last one, yes.
Carcinogens cause cancer and vehicle exhaust, things like that.
Right, yeah, so all sorts of emissions are causing cancer. So there are two things that I think are worth noting here. One is that it's really valuable to be aware of the full spectrum of things that people have been exposed to. The second is that it's a little scary how much they've been exposed to. Right? Even if you have a book, and I could run off easily, I'm sure in this room we could run off 100, 200 different types of arguments on different levels that people might bring up in a discussion with you or that are clanging around their head. And that's just what they've been exposed to. So I'm going to get to the solution to that 2 points from now. But no matter what, whatever is going on in their head, you really can't know too much. Okay, so that's their context. All right, so now we come to the fun part. One other question that I like is, what values do they have that might seem at odds with my position? What values do they have that might seem at odds with my position? So, for instance, somebody who thinks they value environmental quality will certainly expect at the outset to be against my position. And they also might have values that are against your position. I mean, I think to some degree, almost everybody believes that nature is intrinsically valuable, and that to some extent, the rest of nature should take priority over the human part of nature. So we'll talk in a minute about how to deal with that, but it's important to acknowledge. Okay, so what we have now is we've got a very rich understanding of our context and a very rich understanding of the audience's context. And once you have this, it's not obvious what to do next, but it's a very, very powerful position. But I think we can make it even more powerful by understanding the mechanics of bridging from one context to another. So if you want to write this down, I'd say the third crucial step is to bridge the differences between the contexts through addition, subtraction, and modification. So to bridge the differences between the contexts through addition, subtraction, and modification. Okay, so let's do addition. So addition relates to the key parts of your argument. Like, what are the positive things they need to understand to move closer to my position? So for example, let's just say somebody is particularly concerned. They don't hate oil, but they actually like it and they're concerned that we're going to run out of it. So one addition might be the idea that energy resources are a product of human ingenuity and don't run out. So they're afraid because they think nature gives us a very small and finite set of energy resources. And if I can explain to them, no, actually an energy resource is just some form of raw energy transformed into usable energy by the human mind, once they get that, then they're not afraid of running out of energy. They're just afraid of running out of the freedom to create new energy. So that would be just one kind of addition. Or another point that was very powerful in my own journey, and that's powerful in explaining things to people, is that climate livability is primarily a product of technology, not changes in temperature. So this is you might have seen the statistic that climate-related deaths have fallen dramatically as fossil fuel use has increased. But this is mostly because the livability of a climate is primarily determined by the state of technology. And I recently ran across my new favorite example of this, so I'll share it with you. I made a new friend recently, this very successful guy who grew up in India. And I hadn't really concretized what that meant until we were in Houston. We just gotten out of lunch, it was, I don't know, maybe 95, which to me was, in that humidity was torture, and I was ready to flee for California, which I subsequently did. And I said, can you believe this weather? He said, well, this is nothing. Now in India, I grew up and it was 120. And my family was completely poor, and we just, all we could do in the summer was huddle around a fan and try to get closest to this weak fan. And I thought to myself, okay, so right now the world's goal seems to be, let's get their temperature down to 119. And my goal is, get them a damn air conditioner. So that's like, this is what, if you have an air conditioner, you can turn 120 into 70. And if you care about the livability of climate, you want people to have access to technology, which means access to energy. So these are examples of additions, new points that can help someone. But that's not all we need to do. We need to subtract as well. So one way to think of subtraction is so addition is what do they need to know to move closer to my position? Subtraction is what do they need to unknow to move closer to my position? Right? So what's in their head that needs to be removed? So who can think of something that someone needs to unknow with regard to the fossil fuel issue? Yes. What?
97%.
Okay. 97, that's going to go to modification as well. But yeah, 97% of climate scientists agree if they hold it as with climate catastrophe. Yes. Go ahead.
Running out of resources.
Okay, running out of resources. Yes.
Power plants emit harmful, or nuclear power plants emit harmful radiation.
Okay, yeah, in terms of those who also oppose nuclear. Yes.
That if global warming is real, an increase in temperature is not inherently catastrophic.
Wait, that's something that needs to be subtracted or added?
Subtracted.
I had too many negatives, I couldn't quite follow it.
Sorry. Basically, people think that it's inherently catastrophic.
Oh, right. It's inherently, it's a sort of global warming equals global catastrophe. So here's one interesting thing, though, about subtraction. The best way to subtract is really to add. So like with the 97%, if you just say, well, this is a typical kind of response to that as well. Here's a study that says that, you know, it's only 50% or something like that. But really what you need to do, I always think of replacement operations. Like that's what I'm always trying to do because I ultimately want to give them the right context. So if there's some issue about what is the view, what is the consensus view of knowledgeable scientists on this issue and how should we interpret that? Yes, I can subtract certain things, but that only works if I give an actual view. That's why Chapter 4 of Moral Case for Fossil Fuels is very detailed about, okay, this is what has been established, this is what hasn't been established, this is demonstrated, this is wild speculation, this is uncertain. So it's important to know what needs to be subtracted, but the method of dealing with it is usually to add. Now the final thing, do you have a question?
Yeah, do you mean like add a negative? Because you would do it.
No, but it's
like
the so here's a way of thinking about it that I've always found helpful, is that every wrong view is an answer to a legitimate question. So every wrong view is an answer, it's a wrong answer, but it's an answer to a legitimate question. So 97% is an answer to the question of basically what I just said. What is the prevailing opinion of knowledgeable scientists about this issue? Right? That's a very legitimate question. But also how to interpret it. How do you deal with consensus? Why it's not irrelevant, but why you don't just bow to consensus. But so that there's just I always think of these as they're always legitimate issues and they're getting it wrong. And so the way that I communicate, I mean, I could cover this in another talk, but is I'll usually say, yes, this is an important issue. You're raising an important issue, but this is how I think about the issue, and this is what I think the facts are. As against just ignoring the legitimacy of the issue and then just attacking the legitimacy of their position. So that's why to subtract, you really need to add. But you do need to know what needs to be subtracted. You can't just say, these are my 5 truths, I'm just going to say them, because you're oblivious to how they're holding them. Okay, so the final one is modification. So you can think of it as repairing and refining. So what ideas can be repaired or refined to move closer to my position? So the 97% is sort of, it's a borderline between subtract and modify. But here's something, like the warming impact of CO2. So if somebody has heard, well, there's this gas CO2 and scientists have demonstrated that it has a certain kind of heat trapping effect and this is leading to negative consequences. You can't just subtract that view because it's, as Ayn Rand called, a package deal. And a lot of what people believe is in the form of package deals. So there's some legitimate and some illegitimate. And so a lot of your job as a communicator is to identify package deals and then separate the legitimate from the illegitimate. So if they say, well, you know, don't you believe in global warming or something like that, there's a half-truth there, which is, yes, there's reason to be interested in what are the warming effects of CO2, but that doesn't at all imply catastrophe unless you found the evidence of that, and that would require A, B, and C. I'm just curious, can anyone else think of something that would need to be modified, like something that there's half-truth to in somebody's belief about fossil fuels? Yes?
Nature is valuable, but only in its relationship to human life, not on its own competing with value.
Yeah, so you stated I think the truth about in terms of nature as it's a value to humans. It's not a value above humans. But they would have the sense of, yes, nature, the ecosystem is valuable, but it would be a package deal of it's valuable to humans and it's valuable at human expense. And yeah, so you would, but imagine if you just said, you're totally wrong about nature. Like, I want to subtract that. Well, no, they're sort of half right. And a lot of people, this is one of the things that I think that objectivism makes you incredibly persuasive about if you know how to use it, which is that people are very grateful for clarification of package deals if you don't attack them for the wrong half of the package deal. You just explain, yeah, this is a legitimate issue. So this is the category that we're thinking in, and then this is how I think of it. So at CIP we have a lot of expressions like, we don't want to save the planet from human beings, we want to improve the planet for human beings. And someone will say, boom, yes, that's it. Or we'll say, you know, we're anti-pollution but pro-development, versus the idea of being anti-impact, which packages together being anti-pollution and anti-development. So what happens is you start to see more and more of these package deals that can be modified. And so what you're adding in net is you're just adding conceptual clarity and evidence to the person's mind. You're giving them a really clean, organized context, the same kind of context that you're building for yourself, which is why you can't be truly great until you're really, really clear yourself on the issues. Because once you have a super well-organized mind, then you're just leading someone to approach or approximate your level of organization. Okay, so those are the 3 core steps of context bridging. Any questions about that? And then I go to what I think is the most important form of it, and the highest leverage form, which is reframing. Any questions so far? Yes?
Is the idea that peak oil has happened, and therefore we have to go to wind and solar, is that going to be a modification or an addition?
I mean, it's a couple of different, so peak oil itself is I mean, if we just take that is a package deal.
Yeah.
And probably more than 2 things. So so this is the idea that we're going to run out of oil, which is not the right way to think of it, but that oil production costs will permanently become very, very high relative to our ability to afford it, and therefore there will be a catastrophe. But that's wrong in a couple ways. One is that there's evidence that they're going to become that high in any future, but also that if they did, it would be a catastrophe because the price system would just move us gradually toward other alternatives, assuming we're free to develop. So that's an issue where, I mean, so subtraction, addition, and modification, these all run together. I mean, they're not, it's not these three things where one is exactly in each, but there are three elements that are always going on. I'm always adding, I'm always subtracting, and I'm always modifying.
It seems like you could almost do a subtraction and addition, like you add nuclear if you know that the audience is favorable or on the fence about nuclear.
Well, it's I mean, this goes, so I wouldn't put it that way, because it's unless, I mean, you'd add nuclear if it's relevant to your point, but this goes to, the first thing is to be clear on what your point is. What is the essential truth you're trying to communicate? What are the parts of that? Right, so those are the three things that need to happen. And I would say that I was pretty good at all of these by like 2012. But it was still really hard because of the issue that came up before, because there are so many different ideas, right? Because the context of other people has been so just stacked against me that how am I possibly going to overcome? I mean, even with warming, there are 50 different things. You know, you just look at an Al Gore movie, Leonardo DiCaprio movie, it's just this endless series of things, and how do you overcome that in someone's mind? And so this goes to the most powerful form of context bridging, which is reframing. Or you can call it, it's framing or reframing. I'm just going to call it reframing, assuming that the existing frame is wrong. But the key to framing or reframing is establishing explicit fundamentals. So establishing explicit fundamentals. So I'll give you the one that I always use, and it's used in the book. So when I'm having a conversation with somebody, there are two things that I try to establish as explicit fundamentals very early on. And the first, this really should happen in all thinking, the first is the goal, and the second is the means. So the first is, I'll ask them in some form, would you agree that the best decision on this issue is the one that's most beneficial to human beings, or that most advances human flourishing? But some form of, do you agree that we really care about human beings and that we want a pro-human outcome? And then the next question is, would you agree that to get to the right decision, we have to look at the full context? So we have to look carefully at the positives and negatives of all the alternatives. We can't just look at the negatives of fossil fuels and the positives of solar, and we have to be careful, right? We can't just say sea levels are rising. We have to be clear, are we talking about 2 feet in 100 years or 20 feet in 20 years? And almost everyone will say to both questions, they'll say yes. And there are ways, if they dispute the human thing, most people, you can, if you push on it, they'll agree with the human thing. Otherwise, I'll tell them, look, if you really would like more human beings to die, then you should absolutely be against fossil fuels. Right? I mean, if you want to kill off a bunch of human beings, you should absolutely oppose my position, which that usually gets them, right? They don't like it being explicit. But the point is, here's what's really interesting about this. What did I do? I named these fundamentals. And most people will agree to these fundamentals in conversation and in reading. And yet, in their thinking, they absolutely do not use these fundamentals in a consistent way. Few people do. Even the top energy thinkers in the world do not use these. They don't have what I call the pro-human whole picture or pro-human full context approach. So the vast majority of people do not use these. Yet in a conversation, I can make the other person's thinking method better than most of the leaders in the field. So how can this possibly work? So it has these two amazing things. One is that it's easy, and then two is it has this it does so much of the addition and subtraction and modification for you. It's uncanny. But here's why it works. So why is it that I can establish explicit fundamentals in a conversation and have so much power? Well, if the fundamentals make sense, what the person's problem is that they either have a package deal on the issue, so they have a package deal of pro-human and anti-human and don't realize it, I just lost my train of thought. I forget about, can anyone figure out what I was going to say?
Being clear about fundamentals gives you a position of power because it exposes all their flawed thinking.
Oh yeah. Thank you. So that jogs my memory. But now I just got unshocked. So the yeah. What's that?
About the means to achieving the goal?
Yeah. No. It's
package deal.
If the fundamentals make sense, either they have a package deal.
Oh yeah, right. Because it's either, I just thought of this new point as I was talking, so then I got in trouble with my first new point and then forgot about my old point. No. So it's the second one is that it hasn't been explicit. So either they had it a package deal, which you can unpackage by naming the right way to think about it, or you just make it explicit, like they mostly had it, but you make it explicit. So you can, and the thing is, with methodology, at least you can make significant shifts in active methodology very, very quickly, because the right way of thinking makes a lot of sense. And it's really hard to argue abstractly for the wrong way of thinking. And I think people don't realize this because they think of people who deal with epistemology, they think in terms of like philosophers who have these very convoluted views, and I'm always too hard on academic philosophers and whatever. But I'm just saying, like, when I was in college, yeah, if I had equated people's appetite for rational epistemology with my professors, I would have a very negative view. But the average person is grateful for a clear way of thinking about things. So if you just give them a way that makes sense, they'll say, yeah. And the most popular thing that I do in all my work is framework. It's just giving the right framework. So one benefit of this, of framing, is that it's shockingly easy. But the other benefit, and this is the massive thing, is that it's like installing a program in someone's mind that automatically causes addition and subtraction and modification. Because if you think about what's going to happen, if they really start asking questions about pro-human, they'll start to think, well, am I really bothered by CO2 because I'm sure that it's going to harm human beings, or do I just think that there's something wrong with changing things in the atmosphere? Or why am I so bothered by polar bears and I don't seem too concerned about 3 billion people with no energy? Or why do I assume that there's nothing negative about wind, and why do I assume that it's impossible to make fossil fuels work cleanly? So it's fascinating. Once they're reprogrammed, not in a malicious way, but by having an explicit set of new fundamentals, they'll subtract all kinds of things. They'll look for new kinds of facts. They'll be open to things like, well, maybe it's possible that we make our environment better through energy use, because nature doesn't give us a clean environment we make dirty. It gives us a dirty environment we make clean. And certainly with modification, if they're on the premise of, yeah, I want to think of everything with the goal of human flourishing, that's going to just start to organize all their concepts. And if they're really thinking about the full context, they're really going to ask, are all of these decisions I'm advocating really taking into account the full context? And that's why by framing and reframing, you can take somebody who has a context that seems almost unapproachably wrong, and you can rapidly make incredible progress. And that's really what Ayn Rand did to everyone in this room. Right? What she did, I mean, you learned a lot of specific things, but really, she just gave you a set of explicit fundamentals that started on your own changing the way you think and act. And of course, you might not do it correctly at all times, and the people I talk to might not, but it's just an incredibly, incredibly powerful thing. So the art of reframing is, how do you explain in a persuasive way, the explicit fundamentals that are necessary? And that's worth investing a lot in, just getting really good in conversation at effortlessly installing fundamentals. And I'll send out, for anyone who's on the thing, I'll send out the latest stuff that we have on this, including, and I now have it to an 8-step formula where I think you can do this in every conversation. That's what I teach now, so I'm happy to send that out. So if we just go back to the beginning, we've got this thing of, it's really hard to persuade people, even honest people, of ideas they don't agree with. But it's completely possible if you bridged context, which means you understand your context deeply, you understand their context deeply, you combine addition, subtraction, and modification, and throughout all of that, you focus on the highest leverage form of context bridging, which is reframing. So installing these explicit, compelling fundamentals in the conversation. So that's what's enabled me to do a lot of what I've been able to do, and I think that that can lead others in other fields to be successful, and I certainly think that just in your everyday life, that can be useful. So I hope this was useful. Thanks for coming, and if we have time for questions, I can take them. Oh, we still do this? Go ahead.
Hi. You didn't talk much about motivation. Do you mostly deal with people who are already motivated to consider these arguments, or do you have any tactics for compelling that motivation?
Yeah, motivation is, I mean, it's part of bridging a context, because there's a value context involved in that you think that this is vital enough to spend your life, any part of your life, persuading somebody. So that is a thing.
I was talking about motivation of the person who's got to think through this with you.
Oh, no, that's what I'm talking about.
Okay.
I'm saying, so context B is mine. And so I'm only going to really motivate them in an enduring way if there's some motivation we can relate to, right? It's like, okay, I really care about flourishing my life. That's why I like Ayn Rand, and you're just obsessed with Russian writers, so I'm going to motivate you. But right, that's not going to work getting you into a conversation. So the more you're tapped into your motivation, the better you can do that. But that is a vital part of context bridging, so you can think of that as that's very early, because you have to establish very early on in a thought process what is the purpose of the thought process. And one step that I do in my formula for conversation is, in step 2, I always want to get clear on what's the decision we're discussing, including why does it matter. There's often a decision at stake, but yeah, absolutely. But so as a part of a good communication mirrors good thinking, and so people can think without a clear purpose for their thought processes, but that's a mistake, and that mistake gets very revealed when somebody else won't dance with you.
You've talked about in the past about how exactly to use the so-called experts when debating these topics. I think you referred to it in 2 ways, like using the experts as guides or as advisors. So I was wondering if you could briefly reiterate sort of how you approach that part of the conversation.
Well, and definitely the most I elaborate on this is in chapter 1 of Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, where I talk about use experts as advisors, not authorities. But this comes up, this is often a fundamental, it's part of thinking in the full context, because part of the context is how do you know what's right and whom should you go to or where should you go for information. In terms of, I'm just trying to think of this, I mean, it's important to just think of it in your own mind as a means to truth. So I want the expert on nutrition because I really want to know what's true about nutrition so that my body is healthy and I don't get poisoned and die earlier than I need to. Right? That's the goal. So if you think of it that way versus a lot of people's implicit goal, I think, is I want to look smart by referencing smart people. That is a huge motivation in cocktail parties and whatnot. And you can't have any part of that. Or I want somebody to bolster my argument. No, because if your relationship with experts was, I want somebody to explain to me the state of evidence, and that's the goal, and then somebody who's a specialist in the evidence would, all things being equal, be the best person to explain that to you. And then after that, there's somebody who synthesized that, but then you need to look at primary sources. I think take that point in the book, but the main thing is you're using experts because you really want the truth, and recognize that people often bring up experts for rhetorical purposes or for superiority purposes.
So you say that your tactics are mostly for honest people because there is no point in discussing with dishonest people, right? And so how do you find out that the person is honest? Because through this honest person will just, usually they just lie and they say they believe in this, in whatever they believe in, and they say they are honest, but in fact if they're not, it's difficult to recognize it.
Well, so there are different contexts. First of all, I have a lot of tactics for dealing with dishonest people, but they're neutralizing. So I do debates, which are mostly with dishonest people. So like if I debate Al Gore, it's not that I expect to persuade him. And even when I go to rallies, it's not that I expect to persuade them. But I'm trying to persuade the honest observer. But to do that, I need to honestly engage the dishonest person, because the audience doesn't know that they're dishonest. And in the case I'm wrong, then that's good to know. But I mean, the baseline thing is, if I don't have any evidence, I engage the person as if they're honest, and then I just have a threshold for disengagement. And the threshold does not need to mean to be, Alex has definitively decided that this person is morally vicious. That's not, I mean, really I'm just deciding what's worth my time. So what I'm starting to look for are signs that this person is unusually resistant to the truth. Or, I mean, but you know, there could be forms where, let's say, they just have, you know, severe learning disabilities or something like that. And they're trying their best, but it would take a year to explain the greenhouse effect. Then I'm not going to do it. So I just think of it as, if you have a reason to want to persuade somebody, proceed on the premise that they're honest, but be very selfish with your time. And part of my methodology that I'll send out is that I'm very good at ending conversations quickly, and I'm actually very good at having them quickly. So I'm in and out in 2, 3, 4 minutes.
All right, thank you. My question is going to be around listening. I'm a sales professional, and one of the things that we've always used as a tool is the power of listening to your opponent, or not really opponent, but your usually your client, and getting to know their deep truths and what they're believing. And I just wanted to hear your thoughts on basically that is also an additional way of persuasion.
This is a great question, and I want to think about it more, but I think there are a couple of key differences. So in sales, you're dealing with something that somebody, like, where they really have the truth in a certain way. So basically they're saying, I have this value, I have this thing that I'm after in life, and your premise is, but what you don't know, and what I'm going to add to your knowledge, is that if you take actions X, Y, and Z involving our product and service, your life will get better, right? It will move toward that. But it's a very, there's some subtraction and some modification, but you're taking that a huge part of their context is right. A huge part of it is right, which is not the same that I'm taking if somebody is a climate catastrophist or buys into that. So to the extent that somebody is, so that's one thing. So I can't, there's more. The other thing is, so it's right and it's also unique, as in there are a lot of distinctive things about them, whereas people's objections to fossil fuels are not that distinctive. They just fall into a whole bunch of categories, and they mostly fall into things that we've all heard, and then they have different emphases. So the question is, how much do I need to listen? And usually I need to listen to figure out what is the decision that they're most concerned about. Like, is it what to do about fossil fuels? Do they like fossil fuels, or just concerned about fracking? Like, what are, and that's a lot of my process is to get to that. But once I'm there, and even the way I get there is I ask questions. So I'm at the first 3 or 4 steps, I run that thing. But they get to talk most of the time, but I run the questions. It's not, hey Joe, how do fossil fuels make you feel? And then I just recline, or ask them to sit on my psychiatrist's couch. No, I do not want to know. I mean, I don't want to know anything except what issue you're really interested in and what you think the right answer is. And then I'm going to ask you a series of questions about, would you agree that the right answer is the one that promotes human life, and would you agree that we have to look at the full context to get there? And once I get you to agree to that, I'm going to summarize how I think of it, and then we can talk. But I want to get their basic, what they're interested in and how they think about it, and get them, I want to activate the best part of them. And then once I do that, I listen. I customize it in the sense of whatever they bring up, I integrate to that. So if they bring up, but even there, I only allow one topic at a time. So it's like salespeople will have, I don't know sales well enough to know what's the ideal amount of listening, but I sell ideas, and I only listen to the answers to questions that are very, very strategic, and I will go to the next question as soon as it's necessary. And I see people have hours and hours and hours conversation, and they feel like they've sold something because there's an emotional connection. Like, oh, well, this person doesn't think I'm so bad anymore. No, that's not, I'm not spending 2 hours so you don't think I'm bad. I'm changing your life in 4 minutes by asking you questions you never thought to ask. So that's how I think of it. Yes?
So what is the process you go through for identifying the people who will pay you to be persuaded by your ideas?
What's the process I use to identify? I mean, I don't think there's anything distinctive about that for me, and I think it's, I'm sure many, I know for a fact, there are people in this room who are better at that kind of thing than I am, because that's a market research and business development type thing. So let's say one of the things that we do is, really what we sell to industry is persuasiveness. So companies need to persuade their own employees to motivate them. They need to persuade stakeholders to get projects approved, and they need to persuade stakeholders to get better policy outcomes. But even the way that I figured that out is just market analysis. And then my part of it is I need to think about how to solve those things. How I gave a talk on this a couple years ago, how my unique value proposition, how the problems I like to solve intersect with the problems that they need solving. But there are people who are way better than I am at that, and most of what I've learned from those people, which is why it's just good to talk to people in sales and marketing who are really, really good, because they'll just have a lot of insight into the types of audiences that you're persuading. And one thing that I get better at is just treating my intellectual business like a business and learning from people who are way better at business, because I've never found that, I've always just found that the more I learn about business, the more effectively I can use my business to disseminate ideas, and getting people to pay for them is a pretty good test on whether they're valuable. Last question? I mean, I'll be around, but yes?
How do you deal with the situation when you, during the persuasion or during the conversation, find yourself in the situation when the whole new argument arises, for example, in this area of environment, property rights, or government regulation? You know that people would have, fundamentally different approach to that. There should be a lot of government regulation. You think there should be none, or there should be property rights, established, sea, air, whatever. And if you enter that conversation and enter that era, you would spend a lot of time trying to persuade them on these related but fundamental things. How do you deal with that?
Well, you have to decide if it's the issue to focus on. So with most of the environmental stuff, what's going on is that people do not have the proper moral view of the relationship between man and the rest of nature, and they don't have the proper metaphysical or scientific view of the relationship between man and the rest of nature. So they think of not impacting nature as the goal, and they think of man as a polluter parasite, right, who's destroying the ecosystem that he depends on, versus what we would think of as an improver producer. So that's most of what's going on most of the time. So those kinds of issues are what usually need to come up. Because once you're talking about property rights, you already have to have some sort of pro-human standard involved. It can't be, because otherwise a lot of the justification for opposing property rights is that humans can't be allowed, it's just an anti-human thing, right? We can't be allowed to cut down a forest, so obviously you can't have a right, because if you gave a human being a right, he might cut down a forest. So much of it is those things. Now if you get into a property rights discussion, that usually means you've established some important things, and then you get into, okay, what is actually, if we believe that energy production is good, what is actually the way that it should happen? Should it be that the government nationalizes everything and dictates how everyone operates? Should it be that you own your land until a snail comes down, it comes on your land, and then you no longer own it? Because, no, but wait, that's the anti-human premise. So these things, so much of the property rights assault is based on anti-humanism. But once you do get into it, then you just need to know, you just need to make a clear case. But the key is you need to know that that's where you are, and then focus your energies there. But if there are all these prior things that haven't been established, there's no way of talking about property rights. Like, I can't talk to Al Gore about property rights. Right? He doesn't believe in that humans have rights. So rights, any rights of human beings precedes property rights, just as an idea. So the lesson here, regardless of whether you encounter this, is just always be very clear on the question, the one question you're trying to answer. And I basically do one question, which is usually about the right decision about something, one question per conversation. Because if I give them a new way of thinking about that, then they should be grateful and motivated to read my book. Which is that, you know, you have to ask them to take action. The purpose of every conversation is the action that it induces in their mind and in reality. So you always end the thing by, this is part of the formula, but recommend an effective resource. And if they say, oh, well, I just want to talk to you more, it's like, too bad. I'm not like your, rent a talker so that you can just talk to someone and pretend that you're interested. I explained this thing to you. I told you, you thought it was a good point. I'm telling you, this is the best place in the world to learn it. Go read the book, or it was nice to meet you. So anyway, it was nice to meet you guys, and where's the damn air conditioner? All right, well, I'm just kidding. I'll be around, but thank you very much. Thanks to Cassandra and Strive.